What do you do when the best doctors in the world can't save you? For tech billionaire James Rodriguez, the answer came from the most unlikely source imaginable: his 22-year-old black housekeeper who cleaned his Manhattan penthouse at night. Mary Carter walked into his bedroom at 1:30 a.m. and recognized symptoms that had stumped 26 medical specialists from the most prestigious hospitals in America and Europe. She wasn't supposed to be in that room, and she definitely wasn't supposed to solve what Harvard-trained cardiologists couldn't, but she did. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. The Rodriguez penthouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side had seen 26 doctors in the past 8 weeks. Specialists flown in from Massachusetts General Hospital, Cleveland Clinic, and the finest medical centers across Europe. Cardiologists, toxicologists, immunologists, experts who charged more per consultation than most families earned in 6 months, and James Rodriguez, New York's youngest self-made tech billionaire, was still dying. Mary Carter had been working the night shift as housekeeper at the Rodriguez penthouse for exactly 7 months when everything changed. She'd taken the job out of pure desperation. A 22-year-old black woman in New York City, with a half-finished nursing degree and crushing student loan debt, had limited options. The pay was decent, the work was solitary, and most importantly, no one paid attention to her. She was invisible, unnoticed, safe in the way that domestic workers become part of the architecture rather than part of the household. The day shift staff whispered constantly about the young master's mysterious illness, how he'd collapsed during a board meeting 8 weeks ago, how he couldn't keep food down anymore, how his hands trembled so violently he could no longer sign contracts, and how the parade of expensive doctors had run every test and found nothing. It's stress-induced cardiomyopathy, Dr. Patricia Thornton announced after the 18th round of inconclusive testing. Psychosomatic elements, agreed the psychiatrist from Boston. Perhaps a rare autoimmune condition, suggested the immunologist from Switzerland, recommending another experimental treatment that did nothing. Mary had seen James only 3 times before that night. Once from a distance, watching him being wheeled through the hallway, his tall frame collapsed in the wheelchair. Once, when he'd shuffled past supported by his physical therapist, moving with the careful steps of someone 3 times his age. The 3rd time was 2 weeks ago, when he'd stumbled into the library searching for water, with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped the glass she poured for him. "Thank you," he'd whispered, and for just a moment his eyes met hers with a clarity that seemed at odds with his deterioration. Then his nurse rushed in, scolding Mary about being in private areas and ushering James back to his bedroom. Now, on this Sunday night at 1:30 a.m., Mary pushed her cleaning cart through the marble hallways, the residence silent except for the soft hum of medical equipment. She'd finished the guest suites and was heading toward the sitting room when she heard it, gasping, irregular and desperate, then a thud like someone hitting the floor. Mary paused outside James's bedroom door, her heart racing. Should she call for the nurse? But the gasping continued, each breath more labored than the last, and something in her incomplete nursing training told her that seconds mattered. She knocked softly. "Mr. Rodriguez? Sir, do you need help?" No answer, just another terrible gasp and what might have been a whimper. Mary made her decision and opened the door carefully. James Rodriguez was on the floor beside his bed, his body contorted in distress, one hand clutching his chest while the other gripped the bedside table. His skin had gone from gray to nearly translucent, slick with cold sweat, and his breathing came in short, panicked gasps. The night nurse, who was supposed to be monitoring him, was slumped in the chair, softly snoring, completely oblivious. Mary moved without thinking, dropping to her knees beside James, her hands checking his pulse the way she'd been trained. "I've got you," she said quietly, her voice steady. "Try to slow your breathing, in through your nose, out through your mouth." His pulse was erratic and thready, jumping and skipping in a pattern that was definitely not normal, and as she helped him shift position, she cataloged the symptoms: pupils dilated and struggling to focus, skin cold and clammy, visible tremor, lips with a faint bluish tint. And then she noticed his eyes, the way he was squinting as though the soft lighting was too bright, and she remembered something from her pharmacology class, and suddenly several pieces clicked together. "Can you see me clearly?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. "Or is your vision blurry? Are you seeing colors around the lights?" James's eyes widened and he nodded. "Yellow," he managed to whisper. "Everything. Yellow-green, around the edges." Mary's heart spiked because that symptom, visual disturbances with yellow-green halos combined with irregular heartbeat, cold sweats, and nausea, that was cardiac glycoside toxicity, most commonly caused by digitalis. None of the 26 specialists had tested for plant-based toxins because, why would they? Rich people in Manhattan penthouses don't get poisoned with foxglove. "I'm going to get your doctor," Mary said, starting to stand, but James's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. "No," he said, and there was exhaustion and resignation in his voice. "No more doctors. They can't." His voice cracked, and she realized he'd given up. "Please," he whispered, "just stay for a minute." So Mary stayed, and against every rule about boundaries, she helped James back into bed, brought him water, and wiped his face with a cool cloth while the nurse continued sleeping peacefully. "Why are you here at this hour?" James asked when his breathing had stabilized. "I work the night shift. Quieter, fewer people around." "You're American. What brought you to this?" He gestured at her uniform, and maybe it was the late hour or the adrenaline crash, but Mary found herself talking. She told him about starting nursing school at Hunter College, about her mother's cancer diagnosis that derailed everything, about dropping out to send money home, about the student loans growing interest while her degree sat incomplete. "You're overqualified to be cleaning houses," James observed. "Right now I'm exactly qualified enough to keep a roof over my head," Mary replied. "What did you study before nursing?" "Chemistry," Mary said. "I was pre-med at Howard University before life happened." "Chemistry," James repeated, and something shifted in his expression. "You studied pharmacology? Toxicology? It was part of the curriculum. Why?" James was quiet for a long moment. "The doctors have tested me for everything, but what if they've been looking in the wrong place?" Mary understood exactly what he was asking, and she felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. She looked at James Rodriguez, 30 years old, self-made billionaire slowly dying, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "The symptoms you're describing," she said quietly, "the irregular heartbeat, the vision problems with yellow-green halos, the nausea, the tremors, that's not a disease, that's poisoning." "The symptoms you're describing," she said quietly, "the irregular heartbeat, the vision problems with yellow-green halos, the nausea, the tremors, that's not a disease, that's poisoning." James stared at her in stunned silence, his eyes searching her face as though trying to determine if she was serious, or if the illness had finally made him delusional enough to believe conspiracy theories from his housekeeper. "Poisoning?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper, and Mary could hear the war happening inside him between desperate hope that someone finally understood what was killing him and the crushing weight of what that diagnosis would mean if she was right. "I could be wrong," Mary said carefully, already second-guessing herself because who was she to diagnose what 26 specialists had missed, and what if she was just seeing patterns where none existed? "But I think you should ask your doctors to run specific tests for cardiac glycosides, particularly digitalis from plant sources like foxglove, because standard toxicology screens don't always catch those unless they're specifically looking for them." She helped him get settled more comfortably against his pillows, made sure his water was within reach, and then she did what she'd been trained to do in moments of crisis. She documented everything, writing down the exact time, his symptoms, his vital signs as best she could measure them without proper equipment. and her observations about the yellow-green visual halos that were so distinctively associated with digitalis toxicity. Then she quietly left his room, pushing her cleaning cart down the hallway with hands that trembled slightly because she'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And now she had a choice to make. Walk away and pretend she'd never noticed anything, or commit to seeing this through wherever it led. Mary returned the next night with her mind racing and her theory demanding evidence, because without proof, she was just the help making wild accusations that would get her fired at best, and possibly sued for slander at worst. She began paying attention to things she'd previously ignored, watching the patterns of the household with the same careful observation skills they'd taught her in nursing school when learning to spot the subtle signs of patient deterioration. Over the next 2 nights, she noticed something crucial. James's symptoms spiked approximately 90 minutes after his 7 o'clock morning routine, like clockwork, which meant whatever was causing his episodes was being administered regularly at roughly the same time each day. During her cleaning rounds, she started paying closer attention to his daily schedule, and that's when she noticed Marcus Chen, James's business partner and closest friend, arriving every single morning at 6:45 for what the household staff called their power planning sessions in the penthouse kitchen. Marcus personally prepared James's custom vitamin smoothie, an elaborate green concoction with exotic ingredients ordered from specialty suppliers, and Mary learned from the day shift kitchen staff that Marcus had been handling this morning ritual for the entire 8 weeks of James's illness, framing it as devoted support for his sick partner. What struck Mary as strange was how Marcus insisted on preparing the smoothie himself, always waving away offers of help from the household staff with a charming smile and comments about knowing exactly how James liked it prepared and how he always rinsed the blender immediately after James took the drink, but never actually deep cleaned it. Mary began documenting everything with the meticulous attention to detail that had made her excel in her nursing school clinical rotations. She wrote detailed notes with precise timestamps in a small notebook she kept in her uniform pocket. She took discrete photos of her observations with her phone, and she started recording the pattern of symptoms she witnessed during the rare occasions when she saw James during her night shifts. The evidence was building, but it was all circumstantial, all observation without concrete proof. And she knew that wasn't enough to accuse someone of attempted murder. On her 3rd night of investigation, Mary made a decision that could cost her everything if she was wrong, but might save James's life if she was right. She arrived at work an hour early, slipping into the building through the service entrance while the morning shift was just beginning their routines, and she positioned herself in the supply closet adjacent to the kitchen where she could watch through the crack in the door without being seen. At exactly 6:45, Marcus Chen arrived, impeccably dressed in his tailored suit and carrying his leather briefcase, and Mary watched as he moved through the kitchen with the confidence of someone who belonged there. He prepared the smoothie exactly as the staff had described: kale, spirulina, protein powder, exotic berries. But there was a moment, just a brief second, when Marcus glanced toward the doorway to make sure he was alone, when his hand dipped into his jacket pocket and added something else to the blender, something from a small container that he quickly returned to his pocket before anyone could see. Mary waited until Marcus left the smoothie in James's study and departed for his office downtown, and then she waited even longer until James was taken by his medical transport team for his morning appointment with yet another specialist. Then, and only then, did she enter the kitchen wearing gloves from her cleaning cart, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears because this was breaking and entering or theft or tampering with evidence, and she wasn't entirely sure which laws she was violating, but she knew it was definitely several of them. The blender sat in the sink where Marcus had rinsed it, and Mary examined the residue that clung to the sides and bottom with the same careful attention she'd once used in chemistry lab. Using her phone's flashlight and a coffee filter from her own supplies, she carefully strained the residue, and among the expected kale and spirulina and protein powder, she found something that made her breath catch: tiny purple petal fragments, delicate and distinctive, that didn't match any ingredient from the labeled containers sitting on the counter. What would you do if James was your brother or husband? Comment: I stand for the truth. if poisoning for profit can never be justified. She photographed the fragments from multiple angles, then used her phone to search botanical databases with shaking fingers. And when the results loaded, she felt her stomach drop because those fragments matched foxglove, digitalis purpurea, a beautiful ornamental plant that was also one of the most toxic plants in the world. Foxglove contained cardiac glycosides that, when ingested regularly in small amounts, caused cumulative toxicity that perfectly mimicked progressive heart disease, building up slowly in the system over weeks or months. And crucially, standard toxicology screens didn't detect plant-based cardiac glycosides unless specifically requested. The medical elite with their expensive tests and prestigious degrees had been treating James's symptoms while completely missing the cause. And Mary realized with growing horror that this wasn't accidental illness. This was calculated, methodical murder designed to look like natural disease. But identifying the poison wasn't enough, because Mary knew that Marcus Chen didn't strike her as the kind of man who would poison his business partner without an extraordinarily compelling reason, and she needed to understand the why if she was going to expose the who. During her lunch break, sitting in the staff room with her phone and a determination born of desperation, she researched Marcus Chen and Rodriguez Industries, diving deep into public records and business filings that were freely available, but that most people never bothered to read. She discovered that Marcus and James had founded the company together 8 years ago in a Columbia University dorm room, two brilliant computer science students with a revolutionary idea about AI-driven cybersecurity. The company had grown from nothing to a tech industry powerhouse, and now Rodriguez Industries was preparing for an initial public offering estimated at $17 billion, which would make both founders extraordinarily wealthy, beyond even their current success. But digging deeper into the public business filings, Mary found something that made her blood run cold. Buried in the dense legal language of the original partnership agreement was a buyout clause stipulating that if either partner died or became permanently incapacitated before the company went public, the surviving partner would gain 51% controlling interest, with the deceased or incapacitated partner's shares distributed to family members at a fraction of their current market value. It was a clause that had made perfect sense when the company was worthless and they were just protecting themselves against worst-case scenarios. But now that same clause meant Marcus Chen stood to gain approximately $8.7 billion in controlling shares if James Rodriguez died before the IPO. Mary sat in the staff room staring at her phone screen, and she realized she wasn't just looking at a poisoning anymore. She was looking at a murder plot worth billions of dollars. But she also knew the enormous challenge that stood between her discovery and James's survival. She was a black housekeeper with no professional credentials, an incomplete nursing education, and crushing debt, trying to accuse a Stanford MBA billionaire of attempted murder, and her testimony alone would be destroyed in any court by Marcus's legal team before she even finished speaking. She needed irrefutable proof, the kind of evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. And she needed James to survive long enough for her to expose Marcus before he succeeded in his plan. Mary closed her eyes and formulated a dangerous strategy. She would replace the poison smoothies with clean versions to buy James time to recover, and somehow she would catch Marcus in the act of poisoning his best friend, because that was the only way anyone would believe her. Mary spent the next morning at a 24-hour organic market in Brooklyn, using precious money from her meager savings to purchase ingredients that matched Marcus's elaborate smoothie recipe: organic kale, spirulina powder, exotic acai berries, premium protein powder, and all the other expensive components she'd carefully cataloged during her kitchen observations. The total came to $83, which represented nearly a full day's wages from her housekeeping job. But she paid without hesitation because what was money compared to a man's life? And besides, if she was wrong about any of this, she'd have much bigger problems than her grocery bill. The next morning, Mary arrived at the Rodriguez penthouse at 5:30 through the service entrance, a full hour before Marcus's usual 6:45 arrival time, and her heart was pounding so hard she thought the security guard might hear it when he waved her through with barely a glance. She set up her operation in the kitchen with shaking hands, preparing the clean smoothie exactly as she'd seen Marcus do it. Same proportions, same order of ingredients, Same everything except the poisonous foxglove fragments that were slowly killing James Rodriguez. She stored her clean version in an identical glass container in the back of the refrigerator, hidden behind the staff's lunchboxes where Marcus wouldn't notice anything unusual, and then she positioned herself in the supply closet where she'd watched him before, waiting with every nerve in her body screaming that this was a terrible idea, and she was going to get caught and lose everything. At 6:45 exactly, Marcus arrived with his briefcase and his tailored suit and his charming smile, and Mary watched through the crack in the door as he prepared the poisoned smoothie with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this dozens of times before and had no reason to think today would be any different. Marcus left the smoothie in James's study as always and departed for his downtown office, and Mary waited another agonizing 5 minutes to make sure he wasn't coming back before she moved. Her hands were shaking so badly when she entered the study that she nearly dropped the poisoned smoothie, and every sound in the penthouse, the hum of the refrigerator, footsteps in a distant hallway, the elevator chiming on another floor, sent her pulse racing because discovery would mean not just losing her job but possibly criminal charges for tampering with evidence or interfering with whatever investigation might eventually happen. She made the switch quickly, replacing Marcus's poisoned smoothie with her clean version, and then she secured the contaminated drink in a sealed plastic bag, writing the date and time in permanent marker with handwriting that looked shaky even to her own eyes. She photographed the smoothie from multiple angles before storing it in her backpack, documenting everything the way she'd been taught in nursing school when preparing evidence for potential legal proceedings. And then she rushed out of the study before anyone could see her where she absolutely shouldn't be. That evening, the sealed bag went into the back of her own refrigerator at home, hidden behind expired condiments and leftover takeout in the apartment she shared with 2 roommates who barely noticed she existed, and Mary started a detailed evidence file on her laptop with photographs, timestamps, and clinical observations that would either save James Rodriguez's life or prove she was completely delusional. Over the next 5 days, Mary watched a transformation that would have seemed miraculous if she hadn't known exactly what was causing it, and the change in James Rodriguez was so dramatic that even the most skeptical doctor couldn't deny something fundamental had shifted. Day 1 showed minimal improvement because the accumulated digitalis was still working its way through his system, building down slowly just as it had built up slowly, but James's color seemed fractionally less gray and his hands trembled slightly less when Mary glimpsed him during her evening shift. Day 2 brought more noticeable changes. James kept down solid food for the first time in 3 weeks, and his nausea medication was reduced because he simply didn't need it anymore. And the night nurse mentioned to the day staff that his sleep had been more peaceful and less interrupted by cardiac episodes. By day 3, Dr. Thornton was openly amazed during her morning rounds, noting significant improvement in James's heart rhythm and telling the medical team that perhaps their aggressive treatment protocol was finally having the desired effect, and Mary had to bite her tongue to keep from pointing out that they hadn't changed anything about his treatment, except that he was no longer being poisoned daily. Day 4 brought the moment that made even the cynical household staff start whispering about miracles. James walked from his bedroom to his study without assistance, without his walker, without even needing to pause and rest halfway there, moving with a strength and steadiness that had been absent for 2 months. The physical therapist who'd been working with him 3 times a week actually teared up when she saw him walking independently, and even the stern head nurse who'd seen everything in her 40-year career admitted she'd never witnessed such a rapid recovery from such severe cardiac distress. By day 5, James was alert and clear-headed, and asking his assistant to bring him business documents so he could catch up on company matters he'd been too ill to handle, and the medical team was taking full credit for a treatment protocol that had done absolutely nothing except fail to identify poisoning. The doctors congratulated each other on their persistence and diagnostic acumen. The nurses were relieved and hopeful, and the entire household buzzed with optimistic energy that had been absent for weeks. Mary observed it all from her position of invisibility, watching Marcus Chen visit the penthouse with increasing frequency, his congratulations sounding just a bit too forced, his smiles not quite reaching his eyes. She noticed how Marcus checked the empty smoothie container in James's study, How he asked casual questions about whether James was maintaining his supplement routine, how his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when James mentioned feeling better than he had in months. She saw the calculation happening behind Marcus's eyes, the adaptation of strategy that she'd been expecting, and she knew with absolute certainty that Marcus wouldn't simply accept defeat. He'd escalate. The improvement proved poisoning beyond any reasonable doubt, but Mary also knew it meant Marcus would be desperate and dangerous, possibly switching to something faster acting that would kill James before anyone could intervene, and she intensified her documentation while recognizing that she needed more than circumstantial evidence if she was going to expose him. She needed Marcus to incriminate himself, to confess in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away, and that meant taking risks that terrified her. On day 4, Mary made a decision that could destroy her if she was wrong, but might save James's life if she was right, and she approached Dr. Patricia Thornton in a quiet corridor as the cardiologist was leaving her evening rounds. "Dr. Thornton, may I speak with you for a moment?" Mary asked, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins, and the doctor turned with an expression of mild confusion, because housekeepers didn't typically initiate conversations with attending physicians. "I'm sorry, I don't have time right now," Dr. Thornton began, already moving toward the elevator, but Mary stepped directly into her path with an urgency that made the doctor pause. "It's about Mr. Rodriguez's recovery," Mary said, and something in her tone made Dr. Thornton stop completely and actually look at her, really see her for perhaps the first time. "I know why he's getting better. And I know why he was sick in the first place, and you need to run specific tests before it's too late." Dr. Thornton's expression shifted from confusion to dismissive skepticism. "I appreciate your concern, but Mr. Rodriguez's medical care is being handled by a team of specialists who—" "He's being poisoned with digitalis from foxglove plants," Mary interrupted, her words coming fast because she might not get another chance to say this. "That's why standard toxicology screens didn't catch it. And that's why he's recovering now, because someone stopped giving it to him 4 days ago." She pulled out her phone and showed Dr. Thornton the photographs of the strained smoothie residue with the purple petal fragments, the detailed symptom timeline she'd documented, and the pages from her old pharmacology textbook with passages on digitalis toxicity, highlighted in yellow. "I studied nursing at Hunter College before I had to drop out," Mary explained, her voice gaining confidence as she presented her case the way she would have presented a clinical finding to an instructor. "I know what cardiac glycoside poisoning looks like, and these symptoms, the irregular heartbeat, the yellow-green visual halos, the nausea, the tremors, they're textbook digitalis toxicity." Dr. Thornton's initial reaction was exactly what Mary had expected: dismissal, skepticism, the automatic rejection of a diagnosis from someone without credentials, because how could a housekeeper identify what 26 specialists from the finest medical institutions in the world had missed? But Mary persisted, pointing out the 90-minute symptom spike pattern after morning smoothie consumption, the correlation between James's dramatic improvement and the timing of when she'd started replacing the smoothies, and the botanical evidence she'd documented with scientific precision. Something in Mary's presentation made Dr. Thornton pause. Perhaps it was the precise medical terminology that no ordinary housekeeper would know, or the meticulous documentation that looked like proper clinical research, or the pharmacological knowledge that could only come from legitimate medical education. "You said you studied nursing?" the doctor asked slowly, her skepticism beginning to crack. 2 years at Hunter before my mother's cancer forced me to leave," Mary confirmed. "I was 6 months from my clinicals when I had to drop out." Dr. Thornton studied Mary for a long moment, and then she looked again at the photographs and documentation on Mary's phone, and something shifted in her expression. "Cardiac glycosides from plant sources," she said thoughtfully. "We wouldn't have tested for those specifically unless we had reason to suspect poisoning, and we've been treating this as idiopathic cardiomyopathy, which is exactly what chronic low-dose digitalis poisoning mimics," Mary said. And she saw the moment when Dr. Thornton truly understood what she was saying. "I'll order the tests," Dr. Thornton decided. "Emergency digoxin level and expanded plant alkaloid screening, but if you're wrong about this—" "I'm not wrong," Mary said with quiet certainty. And 24 hours later, the laboratory results proved she was right. The laboratory results came back with findings that sent shockwaves through James's medical team. Toxic levels of cardiac glycosides in his bloodstream, specifically digitalis compounds consistent with foxglove plant ingestion, and Dr. Thornton called an emergency meeting with James's full care team to discuss next steps. The cardiologist's immediate recommendation was clear and emphatic. Involve the police immediately, because they were no longer dealing with a medical mystery but with attempted murder, and every minute they delayed potentially gave the perpetrator time to flee or destroy evidence. But Mary argued for a different approach, and she made her case with the same quiet intensity that had convinced Dr. Thornton to run the tests in the first place. Without proof of who's administering the poison, Marcus's legal team will tie up the investigation for months, she explained to James, Dr. Thornton, and James's attorney, Richard Mendez, in a private conference in James's study. He has unlimited resources for attorneys, and circumstantial evidence about smoothies and kitchen access won't be enough to convict him. We need him to incriminate himself, to confess in a way that can't be explained away or dismissed. James, now aware that his closest friend and business partner had been systematically trying to murder him for 2 months, listened to Mary's plan with a mixture of rage and calculating determination. "You want to catch him in the act," he said slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes along with something that looked like grim satisfaction at the prospect of justice. "I want him to confess on recording," Mary corrected, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was proposing. "If he thinks you're recovering too quickly and the IPO is moving forward, he'll get desperate and escalate, probably switch to something faster acting, and that's when we catch him." The plan was risky and possibly dangerous, and Richard Mendez spent 20 minutes outlining all the legal and personal hazards involved, but James agreed because the alternative was watching Marcus walk free while an investigation dragged through months of legal maneuvering. They set their trap carefully. James would publicly announce he was making a full recovery and planned to finalize IPO paperwork within the week, putting enormous time pressure on Marcus and forcing him to act quickly if he wanted to complete his plan before the company went public. Security installed hidden cameras in the kitchen and study, subtle, professional equipment that would capture everything, but Mary knew that the most crucial evidence needed to be Marcus's own voice explaining his actions in detail, admitting to the poisoning and the motive, because video footage of him adding something to a smoothie could be explained away as vitamins or supplements, but a recorded confession couldn't. On day 6, Mary arrived at the penthouse at 5:15 in the morning, even earlier than her previous early arrivals, and her hands were trembling so badly she had to pause in the service entrance hallway to steady herself before proceeding. She positioned herself in the pantry adjacent to the kitchen, the same cramped space where she'd hidden before. But this time she had her phone recording, and her heart was pounding so hard she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. The tension was almost unbearable as she waited in the darkness, sweat forming on her palms despite the cool air conditioning, and she kept thinking about all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. Marcus could see her, could hurt her, could take her phone and destroy the evidence, and she'd be alone in a room with a desperate murderer with only her incomplete self-defense training as protection. But she also thought about James Rodriguez dying slowly while 26 doctors watched helplessly, and she thought about Marcus Chen getting away with murder because nobody would believe the black housekeeper's testimony, and those thoughts steadied her enough to keep waiting. At 5:45 exactly, she heard the elevator chime and Marcus's footsteps approaching the kitchen, and Mary started the recording on her phone, holding it steady with both hands to keep the microphone clear. Marcus entered the kitchen, but instead of his usual smoothie preparation routine, he moved directly to the counter and pulled a small glass vial from his jacket pocket. Something different, something new, and his hand was shaking slightly as he uncapped it, which told Mary he knew this was the end game. From the pantry with her phone held at her side, recording but not obviously so, and her voice was remarkably calm when she spoke. "What are you adding to James's drink this morning, Marcus?" Marcus spun around so fast he nearly dropped the vial, and shock registered on his face for exactly 3 seconds before his expression shifted to something harder and more calculating. "Mary," he said, and his voice was smooth and charming like always, the Stanford MBA performing damage control. You startled me. I'm just adding a vitamin supplement that James's nutritionist recommended. That's not foxglove extract anymore, is it? Mary asked, and her tone was conversational, almost curious. You're switching to something faster because he's recovering, because whatever you've been using for the past 8 weeks isn't working anymore. The accusation shattered Marcus's composure like a hammer through glass, and something shifted in his eyes from calculated charm to genuine rage. You have no idea what you're talking about, he said, but his voice was too defensive, too sharp, and Mary could see him rapidly calculating how much she knew and how much danger she represented to his plans. I know you've been poisoning him with digitalis extracted from foxglove plants, Mary continued, her voice steady and clinical like she was presenting a case study. I know you've been adding it to his morning smoothies for 8 weeks, carefully building up the dosage so it would mimic progressive heart disease, and I know you're doing it because the IPO buyout clause will give you $8.7 billion if he dies before the company goes public. Marcus stared at her in stunned silence for exactly 5 seconds, and then something broke inside him. Maybe it was the stress of months of careful planning falling apart. Maybe it was rage at being outsmarted by someone he'd considered invisible and irrelevant. Or maybe it was simply the desperate need to justify himself to someone. Anyone. Even the housekeeper he'd never noticed before. The words came tumbling out in a torrent of anger and justification, his voice rising with each sentence. 8 weeks of perfect execution, he said. And now his charm was completely gone, replaced by bitter fury. 8 weeks of carefully extracted digitalis, measured doses, the perfect slow murder that every doctor in the world diagnosed as natural heart disease. And you're just the help. You're nobody. You're the person who cleans toilets. You think you can interfere with my plans? Your $8.7 billion plans, Mary said quietly, and Marcus's face flushed with rage. That money should have been mine from the beginning, he shouted, all pretense abandoned now. I did half the work. I built that company just as much as James did, but his name is on everything, his face is in all the magazines, and that stupid buyout clause was supposed to protect us both, but now it's the only way I get what I actually deserve. So you decided to murder your best friend? Mary interrupted, her voice hardening. He would have died peacefully, Marcus said, and there was actually injured dignity in his tone, as though he deserved credit for choosing poison over something more violent. No pain, just a gradual decline that everyone would accept as tragic but natural, and nobody would have ever known if you hadn't. He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize how much he'd admitted. Like and subscribe to this channel if you believe even $1 billion motive doesn't excuse betrayal. If I hadn't interfered, Mary finished for him. If the help hadn't noticed what all the expensive doctors missed. Marcus's expression shifted to something uglier, and when he spoke again, his voice was cold and threatening. You've made a fatal mistake interfering in things that don't concern you, he said, taking a step toward her. Your testimony won't stand up in any court. You're just the housekeeper, probably undocumented, definitely desperate for money. My legal team will destroy your credibility before you finish giving your name, and I'll make sure you're deported so fast. I was born in Brooklyn, Mary said calmly, and she saw confusion flicker across Marcus's face. It doesn't matter where you were born, Marcus said, recovering quickly. No one will believe the black housekeeper over a Stanford MBA, over a billionaire entrepreneur, over someone with actual credentials, and… My phone has been recording for the past 8 minutes, Mary said quietly, and she lifted her phone so he could see the recording interface, the elapsed time showing exactly how long she'd been documenting his confession. The moment Marcus realized he'd been caught was electric and terrible, his face transforming from arrogant confidence to desperate rage in the space of a heartbeat. You… he started, and then lunged for her phone with both hands, shouting that he'd destroy the evidence and claim she'd attacked him, that nobody would believe her anyway. Mary dodged behind the kitchen island, using the large marble surface as a barrier between them, and her heart was racing, but her hands were steady as she held her phone high and away from his grasping reach. Marcus rounded the island and cornered her against the wall, grabbing her wrist with bruising force and trying to wrestle the phone away, while threatening in a harsh whisper that no one would believe her word over his, that she was nothing and he was everything that mattered in this city. The tension peaked as Mary remembered her hospital security training from her nursing school clinicals, and she drove her elbow sharply into Marcus's ribs, hearing him grunt with pain and surprise. When his grip loosened fractionally, she stomped hard on his instep with her heel, breaking his hold completely, and she lunged for the panic alarm on the wall, slamming the red button with her palm. Within 30 seconds, security flooded the kitchen, 3 guards who'd been stationed nearby as part of the plan, and Marcus was trying to restrain his fury, trying to claim that Mary had attacked him, that she was unstable and dangerous and trying to extort money from James by making wild accusations. But Mary, breathing hard but composed, told the head of security to call the police and get James immediately. And she also mentioned that Richard Mendez, James's attorney, was staying in the guest suite and needed to be present. As the kitchen filled with people, security guards, James in his robe looking stronger than he had in months, Richard Mendez in hastily pulled-on clothes, household staff drawn by the alarm, Mary pulled up the recording on her phone and pressed play. Marcus's voice filled the space, clear and damning, explaining the 8-week poisoning timeline, the carefully extracted digitalis from foxglove plants, his plan to escalate to faster-acting poison, the IPO scheme worth billions, and his contempt for the help, who he'd assumed posed no threat to his perfect plan. The reaction was visceral and immediate. James's face hardened with betrayal and rage. Richard Mendez pulled out his phone to call the police while instructing security to detain Marcus, and the household staff stared in horror at the man they'd welcomed into their kitchen every morning. Marcus protested loudly, threatened lawsuits, claimed the recording was inadmissible and obtained illegally, but his own words had condemned him beyond any legal maneuvering. When the police arrived and read Marcus's rights, he stared at Mary with pure hatred burning in his eyes, unable to comprehend how the invisible housekeeper, the person he'd literally never noticed in 7 months of visiting the penthouse, had destroyed his perfect plan. Mary watched as they escorted him out in handcuffs, his expensive suit and his Stanford degree and his billionaire status meaning nothing now, and her hands were finally shaking now that the danger had passed. James stood beside her, watching his former best friend being taken away, and when he turned to look at Mary, his expression held profound respect and gratitude that made tears prick at her eyes, despite her determination to stay composed. 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind that felt both impossibly fast and achingly slow, and Mary struggled to process how completely her world had changed in the span of 14 days. Marcus Chen was denied bail because the judge determined he was a significant flight risk with unlimited financial resources and connections in multiple countries, and he now faced multiple charges: attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and aggravated assault. The evidence against him was overwhelming and irrefutable. Mary's recorded confession capturing every damning word, the poisoned smoothie samples she'd meticulously preserved with dates and times, medical records confirming toxic levels of digitalis in James's system, and security footage showing Marcus's kitchen visits with timestamps that correlated perfectly with James's symptom patterns. The media exploded with the story because it had everything journalists loved: a tech billionaire nearly murdered by his trusted business partner, a dramatic last-minute rescue, and the incredible twist that a night shift housekeeper had solved a medical mystery that stumped 26 world-renowned specialists. The headlines were everywhere. Housekeeper saves billionaire's life. The woman doctors overlooked. How a former nursing student caught a killer. And Mary found herself thrust into public attention she absolutely never wanted and had no idea how to handle. Reporters camped outside her Brooklyn apartment building, waiting with cameras and microphones whenever she left for work or returned home, shouting questions about how she'd figured out the poisoning and whether she'd always suspected Marcus, and what it felt like to be a hero. Interview requests flooded her phone from morning shows and podcasts and magazine writers, all wanting her story, all calling her a hero with a reverence that made her deeply uncomfortable because she'd just done what anyone with medical training should have done when they noticed something wrong. But Mary struggled with the aftermath in ways that the cheerful news coverage never acknowledged. because nobody talked about the trauma of confronting a murderer in a kitchen at dawn, or the nightmares she had about Marcus lunging for her phone and what might have happened if she hadn't broken free, or the surreal, disorienting nature of suddenly being visible and celebrated after spending years being invisible and ignored. She was exhausted from working her 3 jobs because she refused to quit despite everything, while also dealing with endless police interviews and depositions and meetings with prosecutors who needed her testimony documented in excruciating detail for the upcoming trial. James recovered with remarkable speed once the poison was eliminated from his system, his strength returning day by day until he was walking without assistance and working from home and looking like the vital 30-year-old entrepreneur he'd been before Marcus started poisoning him. He insisted repeatedly that Mary should stop working her other jobs, offering to pay her full salary even if she wasn't working, telling her she deserved rest after what she'd been through. But Mary refused every offer with the same quiet firmness that had characterized everything she'd done throughout this ordeal. "I appreciate it, but I don't accept charity," she told him during one of these conversations, standing in his study with her arms crossed and her expression polite but immovable. "I'll work for what I earn, or I'll earn what I need. But I won't take handouts, not from you, not from anyone." "It's not charity," James protested, frustrated by her stubborn dignity. "You saved my life. And you're grateful, I understand that." Mary interrupted gently. "But gratitude doesn't pay my bills or give me my self-respect back. I need to work because that's who I am. And if you take that away from me, even with the best intentions, you're taking away the dignity I've been fighting to maintain since I dropped out of nursing school." The tension between James's desire to help and Mary's need to maintain her independence was palpable, and James realized he needed a different approach, one that respected her dignity while still addressing the catastrophic injustice of her circumstances. James spent those 2 weeks trying to understand how completely his world had failed Mary Carter, and the more he learned, the more ashamed he became of his own blindness. He reviewed his household staffing with his management company, reading through files and contracts, and discovered that they'd hired Mary through a standard housekeeping agency that asked no questions about education or background, seeing only her availability for night shifts and her willingness to work for slightly below market rate. Nobody had ever asked why a 22-year-old woman was working night housekeeping. Nobody had wondered if she had dreams or education or circumstances that had driven her to cleaning other people's homes. He learned the details of Mary's life through careful conversations and discreet investigation, and each new piece of information felt like an indictment of the systems that had let her fall through the cracks. She'd dropped out of Hunter College's nursing program in her 3rd year, just 6 months from her clinical rotations, when her mother's cancer diagnosis and the subsequent medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover made continuing school financially impossible. She'd been working 3 jobs ever since: night housekeeping at his penthouse, weekend retail at a department store in Midtown, and occasional catering gigs for extra money, somehow surviving on 4 hours of sleep most days while sending half her earnings home to her mother in North Carolina. She lived in a 400-square-foot apartment in Brooklyn with 2 roommates, sharing a bathroom and a kitchen, her nursing textbooks packed away in boxes under her bed because looking at them hurt too much. The woman who had saved his life with her medical knowledge and her courage, and her refusal to accept that his illness was unsolvable, had been drowning financially, intellectually starving while cleaning homes for people who never saw her as anything more than furniture. James realized with growing horror that this wasn't just about gratitude or repaying a debt. This was about his moral responsibility and the systemic blindness of wealth that made people like Mary invisible, until they did something extraordinary enough to force everyone to finally see them. He convened private meetings with his CFO, his HR director, and his attorney Richard Mendez, explaining what he wanted to do and insisting that it needed to be structured properly, professionally, in a way that preserved Mary's dignity while providing genuine opportunity. He didn't want to just give Mary money and send her away with a check and a thank you note. He wanted to give her back what circumstances and financial desperation had stolen from her: her education, her career, her future, all the possibilities that should have been available to someone with her intelligence and dedication. James spent hours researching nursing programs at Columbia, NYU, and other prestigious institutions, calculating costs for tuition and books and fees, consulting with medical education experts about accelerated programs that would let Mary complete her degree without starting over completely. He worked with his HR director to structure employment offers that would provide stable income while she studied, and he consulted with his attorney about equity compensation packages that would give her genuine financial security without feeling like charity or pity. 3 weeks after Marcus's arrest, when the media attention had finally started to diminish and Mary's exhaustion was visible in the shadows under her eyes, James invited her to his study for a meeting. The room had returned to its original purpose now, no longer a sick room filled with medical equipment but a comfortable workspace with leather furniture and walls lined with books. And James felt healthier than he'd felt in months, standing at full strength for the first time since this nightmare began. "I know you don't want charity," James began before Mary could say anything. "You've made that very clear, and I respect it. But I'm asking you to hear me out completely before you decide anything." He presented her with a leather portfolio, expensive and professional, and inside were documents that represented a complete reversal of her circumstances. Full tuition coverage for Columbia University's accelerated nursing program, including all textbooks, supplies, lab fees, and every other cost associated with completing her degree. A paid position as his private nurse during her schooling at a salary equal to triple what she'd been earning from all 3 of her jobs combined, which would allow her to focus entirely on her studies without financial stress. A formal contract promising her the title of Director of Employee Wellness at Rodriguez Industries upon her graduation, with a competitive executive salary, full benefits and equity shares in the company worth potentially millions after the IPO, a signing bonus sufficient to pay off her existing student loans completely and cover all of her mother's outstanding medical bills. Mary sat in stunned silence as James explained each component of the offer, her hands shaking slightly as she turned the pages, and her eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall, because she'd learned years ago that crying didn't solve problems or pay bills. "This is too much," she whispered finally, her voice breaking. "It's not charity," James said firmly, sitting across from her and meeting her eyes with complete sincerity. "You saved my life, Mary, and I'm grateful beyond words. But the real failure here isn't medical. It's systemic. Someone with your intelligence and training was invisible to everyone in this household, including me, and that's wrong on a fundamental level. My doctors treated symptoms while the person we all overlooked saw the truth. And that happened because we live in a world where wealth creates blind spots and people make assumptions about who matters and who doesn't, based on job titles and appearance." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "Rodriguez Industries failed you by seeing only the housekeeper, rather than the nursing student with critical medical knowledge. I failed you by walking past you for 7 months without ever wondering about your story or your dreams or what brought you to cleaning houses at night. This offer isn't charity. It's correcting a failure, and it's also an investment in someone I now know has the intelligence, dedication, and courage that my company needs." Mary struggled with competing emotions that threatened to overwhelm her careful control. Relief that she might finally escape the crushing financial pressure that had defined her adult life, gratitude for James's recognition of her worth, validation that her intelligence and education mattered despite her incomplete degree, but also anger, deep, burning anger, at the years of struggle that shouldn't have been necessary, at the system that made her invisible, at circumstances that had forced her to abandon her dreams in the first place. "I accept," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears now running freely down her face. She accepted not as a supplicant grateful for a generous billionaire's largesse, but as a professional recognizing another professional's acknowledgement of her worth and abilities. She accepted because this wasn't charity or pity. It was justice, imperfect and delayed, but justice nonetheless. 1 month later, Mary Carter walked out of the Rodriguez penthouse for the last time as a housekeeper, and she didn't use the service entrance she'd been using for 7 months. Instead, she walked through the front door with her head high, carrying the leather portfolio that contained her future, a future she'd thought she'd lost forever, but had reclaimed through courage and intelligence, and refusing to accept that an impossible medical mystery had to stay impossible. She'd transformed from an invisible domestic worker to a celebrated lifesaver, from financial desperation to genuine security and opportunity, from being dismissed and overlooked because of her race and her position to being valued and celebrated for her mind and her courage. And as she stepped into the elevator heading down from the penthouse, she caught her reflection in the polished brass doors and barely recognized herself, because for the first time in years she looked like someone with a future worth having. Subscribe now to back those who expose the villain. Only the wicked ones will stay silent.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out.